Welcome to the Gunquin demonstration video. I'm going to be going over posing the model and using it for an illustration. I personally like to start with a sketch. I'll find the idea that I want to make first, and then I'll load it into Blender. In the camera, you can add background images, so I'm just finding the image and putting it in. I'm changing it to crop so that it actually fits inside of the camera and doesn't stretch. I'm going to change the pixel dimensions to better match the reference, so it's a roughly 4x6. In this case, because I don't have a background, I'm not too worried about where the floor and such are, so I'm kind of just positioning the camera wherever the mass of the body is. The main motion is the character kind of jumping backwards, as in like a dodge type deal. So I'm keeping the camera somewhat level to where body height would be when standing, and then adjusting the character to match the pose in the reference. In our pose library, we have a preset for the grippy hand, so I am grabbing the pose library pose for that. I am also flipping the pose because the poses are all set for the left hand by default, but I want it on the right hand, so I just have to hit the flip pose checkmark. For this pose, he'll have a sword, so I kind of want to recreate that so I get the perspective on it correct. I'm going to make a cube. I create the cube with Shift plus A, and then find the cube on the list in the meshes. Then I scale it down. On the Z-axis, I scale it very short because then it'll be very flat, and then on the Y, I scale it longer. By default, this rotates around the central point, so I'm going to change it to rotate around the cursor, which is my right click, which lets me rotate it around the hand without having to move the origin point at all. And I'm just positioning it straight in the hand like you would hold a sword. The sword should be aligned with the knuckles because that way if you swing down, it's doing a chop. In order to get the sword to stick to the hand, we're going to add a object constraint, which is in our object constraints panel there. We're going to add a child of constraint. We're going to set the target to the Gunquin armature by using the eyedropper and set the bone to def hand R. Hit set inverse on this panel before you move on. This way it will follow the IK and the FK and switch with the hand and the rest of the arm because it's sticking to the part of the armature that actually moves the mesh. I'm going to switch the transformation mode back to median point, otherwise it'll displace the arm in ways that I don't want it to. So now it's actually rotating where it should again. The reason I like to start from a reference is because I can lay out exactly what I want to be able to see. When just working in 3D, it can be easy to lose joints behind the body due to perspective, where if you have a 2D reference to follow, you know exactly what you need to show to communicate the pose, even if it's super rough. If it's legible, following it will help your 3D poses read better. In this case here, the shoulder is not as visible as I want it to be, so I am technically breaking the rules by moving the shoulder rather than rotating it, but it's still within the realm of reality, so it's okay. I know that I want to have foreshortening on this forward leg here, but as you can see, it's essentially lined up with the camera, which means I won't get any foreshortening on it. So I need to make sure that it's tilting towards the camera in order to get any kind of foreshortening. If the character is aligned with like the frame of the camera, you won't get any perspective on it because there's no depth. So in this case, I just moved the leg forward and it gave me the depth I wanted. Here I'm just messing around with the framing a little bit. I wanted to see if I liked having the arm in the frame, but I kind of like it being cut off, because even though it's hiding a joint, I feel like it feels more dynamic because we feel closer to the character than if everything is in frame. I do want to make sure that this foot doesn't end up getting hidden. Hiding feet can work, but generally I don't want to do that. I also want to make sure any limb adjustments that I make follow the action line that I'm going for. So right now the character kind of looks like a Christmas tree. If we follow the lines, there's a line going up, all of the limbs kind of come off of it like branches at the same angles. So I don't want to mess that up. I want to make sure that the knee is still pointing the right direction. So I probably could have started with adjusting the character mesh, but I left it until now. So I'm going through the sliders, I made it into a dude, and now I am adjusting like the musculature and how the overall body proportions work. It matches the pose that I have in the reference, so I don't need to mess with the arm and leg length, but I will mess with the head size and where the eyes are and some of the details for the fingers and such. So I'm happy with the pose and how the character looks now, so it's time to move on to lighting. This step is only important if you plan to use the lighting as reference for whatever illustration you're working on. It's kind of unnecessary. We could just drop it here and take a picture and use it in our illustration. We don't have to go through this part. Um, so it's entirely up to you and what your needs are. We can add new lights if we'd want to. In the rendering tab, the light settings will show up underneath the render panel. So we can change the light color and we can change the strength and the angle. Changing the color can help if you have a multi-light setup to tell you where the light is actually bouncing. This is really useful for studying light and where it ends up going when it bounces around a character. I've decided that I want to use the phase 2 for the render so that I can get the bounce light on the face as well. However, the skull doesn't have eyelids, so technically it can look normal where eyelids would usually hide the irises. So I just adjusted the head and the eyes a little bit to make a little more sense. With that done and out of the way, I'm going to render my image and save it. I'm just going to call it render 2 because I'm lazy. Um, I'm going to save the Gunquin under a new name rather than saving over the original file. I recommend doing this if you change major things like adding lights or adding objects, because otherwise your main Gunquin file will get kind of messy and you might need to re-download it. And now, in whichever painting program of your choice, I use Paint Tool Sai personally. You can open the image and we can start either tracing over it or just using it as reference, up to you. Sometimes the soft view of the model isn't absolutely perfect, so in this case we have a clavicle that's hidden behind a neck muscle up there. I'm going to render out the muscle version as well as the skeleton version for additional reference. When I'm saving them, I'm naming them appropriately, so at a glance I can tell what they are. Unfortunately, Paint Tool Sai doesn't actually open pictures that you drag in on the same file, so I just have to copy them into it. Generally, I like to start with the character's head, and then I'll move to the clavicles and draw the neck in between. Since I've started learning anatomy, I think the most important part in all of it is first where the bones are, because where the bones are determines where all the muscles are. If you don't know where the bones are, drawing the muscles is painful. It's important to keep checking how the sketch looks alone. Just tracing over 3D doesn't necessarily give you exactly what you want to show. So I could trace all these contours, like in between the fingers there, and then if I hide the 3D, it kind of looks weird. It doesn't look right. It looks better without those lines, even though technically there are like creases or definition there. There are some differences between the muscle version and the soft version. The soft version doesn't use all of the same simulation stuff that the muscles do, so the muscles will stretch between the bones more accurately than the soft version will have them. You can turn off Simplify in the 3D viewport to see a more beautiful version of the muscle model, and then you can use that as reference to figure out what exactly you're looking at and where those muscles come from and go. It's something that kind of is missing from image references that you might get, where you can trace it, but you can't necessarily figure out exactly what you're looking at. So the intent behind the muscle version in this is you can go into 3D, you can see exactly where the muscle comes from, where it goes, and figure out how to recreate it yourself. You might notice that I drew a new center line over the abs. There was an error with this version. I corrected it for the release, so no worries there. But the ab line should basically always follow between the chest and the pelvis. It might bend if the torso's bent, but it should never do a weird wonky inny thing like it's doing there. For the knees, I tend to put a little contour line around the kneecap and the tendon for the kneecap. Sometimes you can put definition for the little fat blob that goes above the kneecap or some of the fat blobs inside of the kneecap. They're the darker circles around the knee there. The top of the forearm there that connects to the top of the hand wraps around from the upper arm. That's where the muscles come from, and because there's a fair amount of foreshortening, it can be difficult to figure out where things should come from and where they should go, but knowing where the muscles should come from on the bone can help you determine that. I skipped ahead a little bit because when I first recorded this, I did a lot of explaining here, but basically the bicep comes and attaches to the forearm bone that goes to the thumb. And because it kind of inserts in between muscles, you end up with that kind of pointy arrow shape on your elbow. So that's where that comes from. I will trace the ear because ears are dumb and I don't like painting them myself, personally. Because the leg is bent there, I will add a crease. One of the most annoying muscles to draw is these guys. They sit on the ribs and connect to the top of the rib. Muscles from the stomach, the obliques, attach below the rib, which kind of creates a braided or like intersecting pattern. Um, I never knew where those came from personally. Like tutorials would show, oh, just draw some squigglies here. But that's where those shapes actually come from. I'm just going around and adding definition to the character to make him look more muscular. I like to put the little lines around where the abs are. That definition is usually very helpful to show off. Some of the leg muscles, the pecs, of course. Just turning off the reference and seeing where it kind of feels empty or there's a lack of information. For the face, I don't actually want to draw it when I have the 3D visible because I don't want to trace the face. You'll end up with same face syndrome if you do that. So I'm kind of just mapping out what the head angle is and then I'll draw my own face on top of it. I may use the skeleton to like see where the eyes are, or where the teeth are to like try to maintain some form. But I'm not tracing directly over the 3D face. The 3D face is primarily meant for light reference. Here I want to give a special shout out to Akami Hippiku. She helped me with the dental accuracy, so all these teeth are somewhat accurate. I'm just checking my reference again for which expression I was going to give him. This shoulder doesn't look very defined, so I'm just going back into the muscle view, taking a look at the muscles and bones and seeing where I should add the definition. The collarbone needed to be extended, and adding some definition to the deltoids helps. Because there's foreshortening on that far arm, making those lines a little bit more defined helps separate what should be flat with the rest of the body to what is quite a bit more curved. From here, I'm now adding details like the hair, and I'll add the clothes shortly as well. Generally, I like to add this in a separate color on a separate layer so I can see what is clothing or hair versus what is the body. Uh, hair, for the hair, I like to draw the hairline, even if I end up doing hair that covers the hairline, knowing where the hair comes from helps. When doing the clothing details, I tend to use the 3D to refer to where seams should go and where the clothing folds should go. So for the glove here, the seams are all on the inside of the fingers, and I can use the 3D to figure out where exactly those are. For the cuff of the glove, I can use the lines on the soft body version to figure out what angle they should be at. Uh, Generally, that can be kind of difficult. You have to figure out like, oh, is it how much is this limb pointing towards or away from me, and then you have to like figure out where the circle should go. But because the soft body has that, I don't have to think about it. Adding the folds for the cloth essentially follows the same rules. I want them to follow the same general curve of the arm as it's going away or coming towards me. And for where it bunches up in like the pants and stuff, it follows the form of the body. So we can use the 3D to place the folds on creases and make sure they're all at the right angle. The legs were a bit hard to tell perspective from, so I added a belt to the close leg, which helps to show the form there. Without it, you can't really tell what's what. So for this last part of the video, I'm just going to really quickly go over referencing the lighting. I'll explain my methodology a little bit so you can try doing it my way if you want to, but you can apply this to your own methods as well. So here I'm just filling in all the flats. Um, Nothing too complicated. I'm picking some very generic colors to get this done quickly. For referencing the lighting, I usually don't trace directly over it like I do with the line art. I scale down a version of the reference, and then I just kind of look at it visually and try to replicate the lighting on the model. I don't want the lighting to interfere with each other, so I don't want the backlight to mix with the fill light that I have. So I'm putting them in the same folder and then making that folder have a layer effect rather than having the layers themselves stack effects on top of each other. This just kind of keeps them separate and so they don't interfere with each other. I'm really paying attention to which parts of the 3D model are catching the light and trying to replicate that the best that I can. So the clavicle's catching light, so it gets some light, but there's some shadow on the neck, so that part gets shadow. I'm trying to group light as much as I can as well. So, like, there's a little shadow on the nose, but I've ignored it because I don't want it to interfere with the overall, like, readability of the illustration. Same with the foot. I'm ignoring the bit of lighting on the foot because it makes it harder to read and we can break the rules. I like to have a kind of burnt effect on my lights for my main light. So what I'll do is I'll select the layer where I painted the main light and then I'll expand the selection and fill that with like a redder or a warmer tone. And that kind of gives me that burnt edge around all my shadows. I use overlay to kind of mess with the saturation and value to bring the focus to areas where I want it and kind of add a slight glow feel to it. I'm not gonna clean him up completely, but I'm just rendering a little bit more to make him more presentable. So there you have it. We use a general sketch, we replicate it using the Gunquin in Blender, we set up our lighting, and then when we get to painting the character, we don't have to think about anatomy or perspective, and we can focus on either learning anatomy or just quickly getting something done.